Good afternoon, everybody, and it is officially 1 o'clock. Welcome to our AIS webinar series. I am Michelle Isaacson, and I'm with the AIS Detectors program, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I do have a few housekeeping items to go over before we start the presentation. We are recording this webinar, and we will post it onto our YouTube channel after the transcription is done in about 1 to 2 weeks is what it normally takes. We do have an all extension conference next week, so it may take me a little bit longer, but stay tuned because you will get an email when that is uploaded onto our YouTube channel. You are also welcome and encouraged to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you'll get notifications through that anytime we upload anything there. Everyone is muted today, and so if you have any questions, and we hope you'll have plenty, we do ask that you send them through Slido, which to get there is just slido.com. And then you put in the keyword cattail, and that will enter you into the questions. If you do have trouble, that's okay. Megan is behind the scenes today, and she is going to be able to move them from chat to Slido. Now you can upvote your favorite questions to give them a better likelihood of being answered by the presenter. So I encourage you to do that as well. And then with that, we would like to welcome Amy Schrank to help us answer the question, can removing invasive cattails benefit our lakes?
Thanks for inviting me here. I'm super excited to talk to you today about removing cattails and can they benefit lakes in Minnesota. So my name's Amy Schrank. I'm with Minnesota Sea Grant. I'm the extension program leader and also a fisheries and aquaculture extension educator. And working with me on this project is Dan Larkin, who's at the University of Minnesota. This project is funded, the project I'm going to tell you about is funded by the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. So with that, I will get started. What I want to show you first, and what I almost always start with, is what a healthy nearshore lake ecosystem looks like in Minnesota. So this is a healthy lake. You can see it's not very developed. You have a few researchers in the foreground here for scale. And what I want you to notice is all of the different types of plants that you see, right? You can see a few cattail in the front here. If you look in the back sort of this, the far side of this lake, you see this brown top plant. This is an emergent plant. It's rooted in the sediment of the lake and grows out of the water. This plant is a bulrush. This is a native, there are a lot of different native species of bulrush in Minnesota, and this is typically the most dominant or important plant in the deeper emergent zone. And I'll show you where all these different types of plants live in a second. As you look out into the open water of this lake, you see there's lots of floating leaf plants. And if you were to submerge underwater, you would see a lot of submerged plants as well. So the idea here is that a healthy nearshore lake ecosystem has lots of different plants with lots of different physical forms. So keep that in your mind. When we sort of teach about aquatic plant growth forms, you may know this already, and if you do, that's great. We talk about a few different types. So we talk about emergent plants as being rooted in the sediment and growing out of the water. So that could be like a cattail or a bulrush. Floating leaf plants, these are things like lily pads. Submerged plants, so these are always fully underwater, things like water celery, a lot of pondweeds. We have free floating plants. Duckweed is a good example of that. And of course, algae, which in this picture is not microscopic, but algae is typically microscopic and is of course not a plant. So all of these plants are components of the littoral zone, a fancy word for the part in a lake where all the light can reach the bottom enough so plants grow. That's the definition of a littoral zone. So what I want you to remember is there's lots of different physical forms, and these physical forms of plants and the variety of physical forms are what are super important to fish. So we teach this in like a linear form, but when you actually take what I think of as a frog's eye view of a lake, you see that these plants are really mixed together, right? You see the emergent bulrush, the floating leaf lily pad all together in sort of a similar area. And when you look at a nearshore ecosystem, you see a lot of open places and a lot of vegetated places. So it's that patchy distribution of vegetation that's important. You need space for fish to live, other organisms too. I'm a fish biologist, so I tend to think of the fish. And you need space for them to move through. If you submerge and take a fish's eye view of this healthy nearshore zone, you see in this picture with the fish here, these are minnows. These bulrush stems are narrow and they provide cover for fish, for other fish predators, but also space through which schooling species can live. So minnows like to school together. There's enough room when you have bulrush for them to swim around and swim as a school. Then you have submerged plants. This is important habitat for food that fish eat, provides important substrate for spawning. And then you have protection from things like avian predators when you have floating leaf plants. So big picture here, it's the physical forms, different physical forms of plants that tend to be really important for fishes. And we know that these nearshore zones are also really important spawning and nursery areas. So almost all fish in a lake will spend some portion of their life in these nearshore zones, whether that's laying eggs there, growing up there as a little larva, or you can see there's a baby northern pike here, or feeding in these nearshore zones. So in addition, there are small-bodied species such as these 4 different species of minnows that spend their whole lives in these nearshore zones. So they live there their whole lives, and these small fishes are super important food for larger game fishes, which humans tend to care about a little more. I tend to love the minnows, but these big charismatic game fishes are what people are often going for, and the reason many folks visit and live on lakes. So what's happening with our lakes in terms of cattail? So again, think of that really diverse environment with lots of different types of plants. When we have invasive cattail come in, we, instead of all those different types of plants, see really a monoculture, a dense stand of hybrid cattail like you see here. This is a nearshore zone actually in northern Lake Huron. And rather than that, what we call a heterogeneous or really patchy environment, we get a really homogeneous environment that's a really dense cattail stand. And as you'll see in a minute, this can cause some issues for things like fish, but also other organisms as well. So at this point, I'm going to diverge into what cattail do we have and why. So one of the most common questions I get asked. So we do have a native cattail. It's called broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia, if you're interested in scientific names. And we also have a non-indigenous or non-native cattail called narrowleaf cattail or Typha angustifolia. Likely came from Europe during European colonization, and I'll show you a map about that in a second. People always go, well, how can I tell these apart? So these 2 species are not too terribly difficult to tell apart. So when you look at our native cattail, the name is broad-leaved. It has a broader leaf. It's really hard to tell that unless you're comparing it directly to a narrow-leaf cattail. So it might not be so useful just going out into the field. But if you visit a cattail stand during flowering, what you'll see is this male part of the plant, which is the yellow sort of part on top, and the female part of the plant, which is called the catkin or the spike, they are almost touching. So where that arrow is, you can see they're really, really close. Again, you can only see this in summer when the plant's flowering. And then if you look at the narrowleaf cattail, you can see there's a lot of space between the male part of the flowering part of the plant on the top and the female part of the plant on the bottom. In addition, that narrowleaf cattail has a narrow relief, but again, it's hard to tell unless you're comparing. So the complication really comes when these 2 hybridize. So whenever you have our native species and the narrowleaf cattail in close proximity, they always hybridize. And it's that hybrid that is that aggressive invasive. So in terms of identification, if you have a hybrid cattail, that's called Typha x glauca. If you, again, care about scientific names, you'll have intermediate characteristics. So you'll see sometimes that male and female part of the plant is kind of close together. Sometimes it's further apart. Sometimes it even looks super close together. So it can be really hard to tell apart. When the stand grows aggressively large and you have these intermediate characteristics, you can kind of determine that you have a hybrid cattail, but it's pretty hard if you're just going to go out and take a look. So when and why did it get here? This is an older map from 1999, but I actually really like how it shows you sort of how the invasion of Typha x glauca started, or hybrid cattail. So if you look at this map and you see this dark line along the eastern seaboard here, that corresponds to about 1860. That was the time during which Typha x glauca first showed up in North America. We know that because of a couple reasons. First, pollen grains. You can actually determine those 3 species by looking at their pollen grains. And if you take a sediment core in these areas, sediment cores are pretty cool because you can use pollen grains to sort of get an idea of what plant communities were there in the past. So by looking at sediment cores, they know that Typha x glauca appeared right around 1860. In addition, there's a lot of herbarium records from early botanists that show that it not showing up until 1860. But then if you look at this checkerboard lobe that represents 1949, scooching out towards this red star. The red star represents Minnesota. You can see that our hybrid cattail has been in Minnesota since at least the late 40s. So it's been here a long time. People don't necessarily realize that. So it's a little bit of a sneaky invader. It looks like our native species, and it's been here a while. You can see that it's expanded, the 1967 and the 1999 range map. If you looked at a more current range map, you would see that the spread continues. There's quite a few populations also in Washington state. So it continues to spread across the United States and Canada and cause problems in a lot of places. So to show you kind of what happens over time with hybrid cattail, I'm showing you an older aerial photo from 1972. This is Jackfish Bay of Rainy Lake. So Rainy Lake is in way northern Minnesota. And what you're seeing here, these gray blobs are islands and the black is water, right? Rainy Lake. And you can see these islands have been recently connected by these causeways. And if you talk to folks in this area, or if you've been in this area yourself over a long period of time, people will talk about water skiing, between these islands before they put those causeways in. And you can imagine there was probably a lot of water flow between those islands that maybe got blocked up once those roads were put in. So what I'm going to show you next is an aerial photo from 2020, so almost 50 years later, to see the difference between these islands. So this is 2020, and you can see this is just from Google Maps, so it's a little bit blurry. And what you see now between those islands is all this brown. And all of that brown is invasive cattail, right? The water level was low at one time, and Rainy Lake is kind of a reservoir because they change the water level pretty frequently. Invasive cattail moved in, and it's continuing to grow over about, a little less than 50 years. And actually the folks in this bay are working to try and figure out a strategy to do some removals. You can see they cut channels into this cattail to try and get boats out and all that kind of thing. But it's a good illustration of what's happened. And this tends to happen slowly over a long period of time. So it's like when a small kid grows up, you don't notice the growth until you come back 10 years later and you see that that kid is bigger. Sometimes that happens with cattail. You don't realize how far it's spread unless you've gone away for a long time and then come back. So just a little bit about cattail biology. Cattail reproduction is not super special compared to other wetland plants. It reproduces by wind dispersed seed. So you've probably seen this in the fall, these little tufts that blow away. It also can reproduce clonally by rhizome. So rhizome is just this underwater root. Lots of wetland plants have this. So you can see we pulled this clone of cattails up and it's connected underneath the sediment by its rhizome. If you were to cut this rhizome, it could actually shoot out another root and then shoot out another stem. So they reproduce clonally. Bulrushes do the same thing. So lots of wetland plants reproduce this way. But when I talk about clones, that's how it's happening. Those rhizomes are going out and then new stems come up. But that's not unique to cattail in particular. So why is it that these hybrid cattail take over if they're not super special in terms of their reproduction? The reason most people conclude is something called hybrid vigor, or heterosis, was just a fancy word for hybrid vigor. And the idea there is that the offspring of two parent species just does better in an environment than either parent. So for example, in this photo, you have parent one, parent two, they reproduce together and you get this bigger, better ear of corn. Hybrid cattail is a little bit like that bigger, better ear of corn. It just really takes over and grows aggressively in our environment, especially in the Great Lakes region. So to talk about some of these characteristics that hybrid cattail have, they have a much faster growth rate than either of the parent species. They grow to a larger height. So you can see that in this photo, this sort of dark green is hybrid cattail. You can see how much taller it is than native vegetation. This is in the shore of Lake Huron. The water here is a couple 3 feet deep. It really grows much taller than anything around it, including your field technician. And I'll show you some pictures of that later. It forms larger clones than either of its parent species. So bigger populations, if it's not really a population, but bigger clones of cattail form with the hybrid than either parents. And because it grows tall and larger clones, it creates a lot more biomass. So biomass is just plant material. So you can see all that live plant material standing there in that photo. When it dies, it just falls down, packs down, and that biomass then suppresses the growth of other plants by just blocking access to light and sometimes access to nutrients. So the biomass of cattail can be a problem. Cattail is also tolerant of a wide range of water conditions. So a lot of times what happens in lakes in Minnesota is you seem to go through a period of low water, hybrid cattail moves in, and then water levels rise, but cattail are pretty tolerant of that. So they can survive in both shallower and deeper water than either of their parents. It likes nutrient-rich systems. We know that we put nutrients into our lakes in many ways, unintentionally. So that's pretty good for cattail, and it's pretty tolerant of salt. So we salt our roads. We know that can be problematic for things like amphibians and some sensitive plant species, but it doesn't seem to bother hybrid cattail too much. So what do we know about it? I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that's been done and then what we're doing in Minnesota. So in northern Lake Huron, we looked at sites that were not invaded with cattail, so uninvaded sites, and then cattail invaded sites. And just to give you a quick rundown of what we saw when we compared these two types of locations in the lake, in cattail invaded areas, we saw lower oxygen in the water, so we call that dissolved oxygen. We saw lower plant diversity, so fewer different species of plants. It was dominated by cattail, and there were not very many other species there. Lower fish abundance, so lower numbers of fish, and fewer fish species, lower fish diversity. So we're definitely seeing negative effects of cattail in the Great Lakes themselves. So we started getting interested in how hybrid cattail management might be able to help mitigate these negative effects. Is there anything we can do, given that we're never going to eradicate cattail? How can we manage it to help mitigate these negative effects? In addition, we hadn't really looked at cattail invasion in inland lakes, so that's sort of one of our questions as well. So what are our options for management? We know that we can spray it with herbicide. That's being done a lot in the prairie pothole region of Minnesota and further west because there's a lot of hybrid cattail in those wetlands. In lake systems, herbicide is not great for things like larval fishes or amphibians. So it can really have a lot of what we call non-target effects, affecting things that are not cattail. A lot of people burn cattail. This can be a good way to get rid of the biomass, especially in the winter, if you're trying to handle it. Again, it's hard in a populated area and sometimes does also have non-target effects. You can mow it and get rid of that biomass. That's something you'd have to do every year annually. And then another option is to cut it below the water. So what we kind of call mechanical removal of cattail. And this is what we're looking at. And the reason we're looking at this is when we did some work in the Great Lakes region, we were opening some channels to try and see if we would see an increase in fish communities. What we realized is when you cut cattail below the water, so those stems are the cut stems are submerged, which is a significant amount of work, as you can see by these people in this picture. We did see plants regrowing in the same summer. So you can see these floating leaf plants growing in the place where we removed cattail. So essentially, you're basically opening up the canopy. So we get rid of the cattail, we get rid of the biomass, light then gets down to the sediment. Native plant seeds, aquatic plant seeds, remain viable in the sediment for a really long time. This is adaptive because, of course, we know water levels change a lot. So they are able to grow once conditions are good. And if you can remove that cattail and provide good conditions, a lot of times native plants will regrow. So we thought this was a good option for us. This is just a little fun fact about wetland plants. What you see here is a cross section of a cattail. So we've cut it in half and you're kind of looking down the stem. Wetland plants are pretty cool, cattail included. They're rooted in the under the water, right? So those roots need oxygen, but they're underwater. So plants have what are called arenchyma, which are basically these holes in the stem that allows oxygen to move to the roots efficiently. So when we're cutting those stems and they become submerged, we're essentially drowning that stem. We don't kill the entire clone, but those stems typically do not grow back until they become, unsubmerged, basically, until they come out of water. So that's why that process seems to work pretty well. We also note that when we zoom out, right, and look at the scale of a whole lake, we're making these channels all the time, whether it's to get our boat in and out, to get, to be able to let the kids swim, to get a view to the lake. We are already creating these channels. So our overall question is, how does mechanical harvesting of cattails affect nearshore plant and fish communities? And is what we're already doing, can that provide a benefit in terms of nearshore lake zone restoration for fish and other organisms? So that's a big picture question. I'm going to show you a little bit about what we've done over the last few years and what we're planning in the next couple of years to look at this in Minnesota. So we decided to look at this in Minnesota. Can these channels in the cattail removed channels in these lakes provide any benefit? So we chose 9 lakes. You can see that our northernmost lakes are Rainy and Cabotogama in Voyagers, and then our southernmost lakes are near the Twin Cities. And just want to give you an overview of what we did. So this is just an aerial photo from Big Marine Lake near about 45 minutes northwest of the Twin Cities. You can see some researchers here for scale. We basically went to each of these lakes, found some areas where there were tons of cattail, and chose 2 sites. One was a control site where we never removed cattail, and then another was a removal site where eventually we removed cattail. So you can see that here, and then you can see the aerial photo there. Note that in real life, these sites aren't that close together, but we wanted them to be similar in terms of substrate and sort of the direction of the wind and those types of things. So they weren't super far apart, but probably not as close as this photo. So to give you an overview of what we actually did in our first couple of years of the project, in summer 2021, we chose sites at all of our 9 lakes. So we chose a cattail retained and cattail removed sites, but we didn't remove cattail yet. We wanted to see what conditions were like before we actually removed cattail. So we went out to these lakes. We measured 3 variables, WQ, which is basically water quality, looking at dissolved oxygen and temperature. We measured the plant community by my little plant icons here, and also the fish community. So we did that at all 9 lakes. Then in the fall, we removed cattail at one of these 2 sites. This is what our removal looked like, obviously in the winter. We removed an area 30 feet wide from shoreline to open water. Currently, with the Minnesota DNR, you can get an aquatic plant management permit to remove a swath of vegetation 15 feet wide from shoreline to open water for your boat or whatever that approved permit is. And we decided to double that permit width to see what would happen in terms of fish community. So we did that in fall of 2021. And then we came back in summer of 22 after cattail were removed at one of those 2 sites and remeasured those variables again. So it's a pretty straightforward experimental design. So what I want to show you right now is some of the data, some of the things we found. I promise there's not too many graphs. And then what we're going to do as a next, what we are doing actually right now as a next step. So first, remember I told you we found lower dissolved oxygen in cattail stands. So we were really interested in that because dissolved oxygen is super important for fish species, bug species, and lots of other organisms in lakes. So I'm going to walk you through these graphs. There's no data on there yet. Mean dissolved oxygen is on the y-axis. That just means how much dissolved oxygen is in the water. We measure it in the water column. And then you have time of day on the x-axis. So 6 in the morning is 600, 1600 is about 4 p.m. So morning till afternoon. And this is 2021 data I'm going to show you. Remember, this is before we removed cattails at any of our sites. So what you see here is not a lot of pattern, right? You can see by the lines that in both our retained and our cattail removed sites, dissolved oxygen increases throughout the day. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But at both of these sites, there's not really any difference. And that's great. What we were hoping is that we would see very similar things at these 2 cattail sites before we remove cattail. So this was good news to us. So now I'm going to show you the same graph, but after we removed cattail at our removed site. So you see, same things here, same colors. Blue is removed, orange is cattail retained. But what you're seeing is there's starting to be a separation of those lines. We still see that increasing relationship between oxygen and time of day, but we see more oxygen at all times of day in our cattail removed sites compared to our cattail retained sites. So what we conclude is that oxygen is increased in cattail removed sites relative to cattail retained sites. So when you remove cattail, more oxygen is moving into those areas. And this is what we think is happening. What we do know is that in the morning, in wetlands or in nearshore zones, dissolved oxygen in the water is super low. This is very common. The reason for this is at night, it's dark. When it's dark, you don't have any photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis releases oxygen into the air and into the water. So we expect to see that really low point in the morning. It increases throughout the day as photosynthesis increases, but also as oxygen-rich water from the middle part of the lake, where it always occurs, is moving in by wave action. So what we think is happening in places where there's pretty sparse vegetation or lots of patchy open habitat, that oxygen-rich water can get in there pretty quickly. But when you have a really dense cattail stand, if you've ever stood in one, you will know that it is so dense that that water really doesn't propagate very quickly into those interior zones. So what we think is that dense cattail stands are really cutting those interior areas off from that open water zone of the lake. And that's why we're seeing some of that decreased oxygen. So what about plants? Well, we took a really, sophisticated approach with passive revegetation. And I'm being sarcastic because what that means is we did nothing, right? We just opened up the canopy. We did not replant, we did not reseed, we just removed cattail. And what we saw is that plants did grow back, even in the first summer. Remember, we removed cattail in fall, and we saw new plants grow in the summer. So you're looking down here at a quadrat, and you can see plants growing back. This is Mike Tuma, one of our grad students, looking at plants, and you can see floating leaf plants around him where they didn't occur in the previous year. And just to show you some of the data for this, again, I'm going to walk you through a graph. Mean submerged vegetation on the y-axis in percent cover. So submerged, remember, vegetation below the water. Year on the x-axis, a reminder when we removed cattail. You can see at our sites in 2021, right, when both of them had cattail, they had less than 10% submerged vegetation. So mostly it was cattail. When we removed cattail and compared their sites, just a reminder of what that looked like in our lake, removed is in blue. You can see that we saw significantly more submerged vegetation when we removed cattail. So this really matches what we saw visually. We saw plants growing back even in the first summer. So I think that's really good news. One really important thing about cattail is biomass, as I mentioned before. That biomass, dead cattail, smashes down, it suppresses aquatic plants, and it can make aquatic environments almost terrestrial. So removing that biomass can really be helpful. And as you can see, Brendan doing it, it's a ton of work as well. And you have to be careful where you put it, and I can talk about that later. So what about the fishes, our last question? We sampled fishes using minnow traps. You can see folks here emptying a minnow trap, and you can see Brendan showing you how tiny these fish are, right? We're looking at fish in a cattail stand. So they tend to be small fish that we're looking at. Again, just to show you some of those data, fish abundance on the y-axis, CPUE means catch per unit effort. It's just like number of fish per trap. So really just think of this as number of fish on the y-axis. My colors are different. Cattail removed is now in yellow. Cattail retained is now in green. This is 2021 before we removed cattail, and you can see that there's really no difference in fish abundance. We saw pretty much the same number of fish at both of our sites. We removed cattail, and into 2022, we saw pretty much the same number of fish at every site. So we really didn't see a lot of difference in total fish abundance. And then we got to thinking, well, maybe different fish behave differently. Maybe we should be looking at species or different fish families. So we did that and didn't see a ton of differences, but one difference did come out, and that was in minnows or the minnow family. So minnows can mean a tiny fish, but also there are specific minnow species. So these are minnow species that never grow much bigger than this. And so you have minnow abundance on the y-axis, and again, same graph, removed in yellow, retained in green. In 2021, note these numbers are super small, right? We're not seeing very many minnows overall, but you can see their distribution, their abundance is about the same in both of our site types. In 2022, when we removed cattails, we saw quite a few more minnows in the removed sites than in our cattail retained sites. Again, I look at this with caution because the number of minnows overall were pretty small, even though our difference was significant. But we do seem to be seeing more minnows in places where we remove cattail. And I'll talk about why this might be important in a second. So you've seen all of our data. A couple important caveats here. The first one is water level. So this is Rainy Lake, and so as you can tell, it's in the fall. These are our temperature loggers, which we're supposed to monitor water temperature, but water gets drawn down in the fall, and you can see our cut cattail stand is largely out of water. And you can see really what happens to these stems as soon as the cut stem, is not submerged anymore. It grows a cattail. So we see a lot of regrowth when water level drops. So that's a really important consideration when we're thinking about cattail removal. Shout out to Voyageurs National Park. They did all the cattail removal for us in Rainy and Capitogama and were really helpful to us for our project. So water level is important. The other really important component is public outreach. We can think about native plant restoration, or we can think about cattail eradication. And we are thinking about native plant restoration. So if you go to any lake association and say, it's great, you should just remove all your cattail, they would be thrilled, right? But that's not the point. The point is we want native plants to grow back. Fish need that variety of plant physical forms in order to be happy and healthy and survive and reproduce and have food. So we really focus a lot on native plant restoration. We've done a few workshops in association with MACIRC. This is at Big Marine. You can see Brendan Nee, a grad student on the project over here, and also with his handout, showing people what our sites were like and what we're trying to do and the importance of native plant restoration. So that's really one of our strong take-home messages is growing native plants back. So what are we doing now? Just a couple minutes about phase 2, which has already started, again, funded by MACIRC and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, led by Claire Rood, a research fellow who joined us in May and who I'm super happy to have with us. And if you happen to be at the showcase for MACIRC next week, she'll be talking. Our current research is to monitor cattail regrowth and determine what maintenance is required to sustain openings, which is going to be really important. Claire and her crew spent quite a bit of time sort of recutting those cattail stands. So that is a consideration for any of this type of work. We're really interested in studying fish use more in these cattail openings. What's happening to them at different times of the year? We're going to use a couple of different methods to do that to try and get a better handle on what's happening there. And then finally, we're going to compare our already existing cattail retained and removed sites to an uninvaded site, which we didn't do in our first couple of years. So a quick overview of what that's going to look like. We definitely are going to do this summer, which is already done, summer 2025, and hopefully into summer 2026. We'll see. Same variables before, but again, now we're just going to essentially collect data at each of these summers at these 3 types of sites: retained, removed, and then uninvaded, where there was never cattail. We're interested to know whether a cattail removed site can approximate an uninvaded site, or if it's intermediate between uninvaded and cattail retained. So if you fell asleep during my whole presentation, here's what I want you to remember. Okay, so pay attention here. Mechanical removal of invasive hybrid cattails. When we do that in the way that's shown in this picture, this results in increased dissolved oxygen, increase in native plants, and I would say cautiously a benefit to the fish community, but we do need some more data. I think the interesting finding we have is that minnow species tend to increase in these openings relative to cattail stands. And I think this is pretty important in terms of other fish in a lake. So if the other dominant species we see in these regions are all of these different types of sunfishes, as well as mud minnow. Note their body form is really different than a minnow. So the anti-predator strategy of a baby bluegill is to go right into deep vegetation. They're pretty good under slightly decreased oxygen conditions, and their body form has them really good at swimming in these really densely vegetated areas. Minnows are not the same. They like to school. They like more open habitat. They prefer edge where they have openings to swim through. And when a predator comes, they want to school up. They don't go into the vegetation. So what do predators eat? So if you look at larger walleye, not the biggest walleye that are eating fish in the middle of the lake, but larger walleye or bass or even northerns cruising along the shore, and when researchers look at their stomachs, they're not necessarily eating these small sunfishes. They tend to be eating minnows. So it's these minnow species that are more available to these predator fish. And so I think if you're seeing a decline in minnows or a decline in minnow habitat as cattail moves in, you could really have some ramifications for your predator species. But again, we definitely need more data for this. So take-home messages: dissolved oxygen increases when you remove cattail. We've shown that. Native plants also increase with cattail removal. We tend to see more minnows in cattail removed plots, but again, I think we need to continue studying this to have some more robust data. Data suggests that cattail removal is effective in terms of restoration, but water level has a big impact, and it really can sort of derail that depending on the time of year. And native plant restoration is really the point. That's what we're going for in these situations. So I cannot talk about this without thanking the field crew, because that's who does the real work. Brendan Neum, Mike Tuma, they're standing side by side here. They were our graduate students on the original project. The 2 undergraduate technicians who are both doing the same thing, I caught them doing this in different years. They didn't even work together. This is Kaylin Schmidt and Dylan Don from UMD. Claire Rood in the orange, who is the research fellow now. Her technicians were Emily Gillette in the boat and Ryder McClure. Emily just graduated from U of Minnesota, and Ryder's an undergrad student at UMD. So they are an awesome crew, and they really are the people who do the work. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. You can check out our Minnesota Sea Grant website for more information and project updates, our MACERC website. Of course, thank you to our funders, MACERC, Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, and help from Voyageurs National Park, and also the DNR. We had a lot of help from aquatic plant management and fisheries biologists. So happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy.
Yeah,
if you don't mind, I'm going to try and take over. There we go.
Yeah.
I will take over screen share.
Perfect.
All right. So for questions, just a reminder that we are using slido.com. You can scan the QR code or go to slido.com and then enter the keyword cattail. And we do have some questions that have come in so far. And also a reminder that you can upvote questions. So if you really like a question and you want to make sure it gets answered, just give it a thumbs up and it'll boost it up towards the top. All right, so our first question here, there's first a statement. Climate models predict Minnesota will be more prone to both high precipitation events and drought, which will likely cause greater fluctuations in water levels. How may that impact the benefits of cattail removal projects?
Really good question. I think the main way is by those droughts. And interestingly, so during our first 2 years of the project, we both had severe drought and severe flood. So it makes it really challenging. Having gone back this summer to look at the removals that happened in 2021, in places where water was low, those cattail grew back pretty quickly. So I think that extreme fluctuation is going to require more maintenance. If removals happen, you would have more maintenance, especially when water's low. So I would also say that cattail does have an upper limit in terms of depth, right? So when water is very, very high, cattail doesn't do as well in the deeper places. But as soon as that water recedes again, cattail can move in and take over. So I don't think it's going to get rid of our cattail, but I do think we have to be mindful of those lower levels if we're going to think about managing it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Does the season of removal of the cattails have any bearing on success for restoration?
Yeah, I think so. So usually the sort of best practice is to remove it when it's sort of senescing or done growing. So like late summer, probably more early to mid fall. I think our best removals were after it really got cold and most of that cattail was dying back. We found when we removed it in spring this year, it actually grew back over the summer quite frequently. So the best time is at the end of the season when cattail is already dying back, those sort of, its nutrients are kind of coming back into its roots. We would really like to experiment. We did once in our first removals of cutting it over the ice and then removing it again in this, removing the biomass that's left in the spring. We work with Washington County Parks at Big Marine. They would like to do some burning over the ice to see if you can handle that for getting rid of the biomass. So the short answer is fall and winter would be the best time. And there's lots of interest in trying to experiment with it. The dead cattail is a pain to handle. So getting rid of it any way you can is helpful.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So the question next is, can we pull cattails from our lake if they are confirmed invasive or hybrid?
No, you cannot without a permit, right? And I have zero influence on the DNR, right? So I'm a Sea Grant researcher, and I can speak to what you need to do to remove cattail is get a DNR aquatic plant management permit. Hybrid cattail are not and I'm going to get the wording wrong here, are not a prohibited invasive species. So there's a lot of species in Minnesota that are prohibited invasive species. You can't even have them, right? You can't transport them, you can't collect them, you can't do anything with them. And cattail really isn't like that. And the reason is it's very hard to tell it apart. So people often use cattails to camouflage their boats when they're duck hunting. And you can still use invasive cattail for that. That's not prohibited. And I think the reason is it's really hard to tell apart. So you have to go through the aquatic plant management permit system for DNR to get rid of it. I will say that is not difficult. We did that for our removals. There are permitting systems on the website. The crew is super responsive. They will come out and take a look at your spot and talk to you about your permit. So it's not prohibitive, and I think it's also not expensive. I think it's still under $50. So, but you can't do it without a permit.
Right. And speaking of permits, can people with a mechanical plant management certification getting a permit to remove, can they remove more than is allowed with the standard permit requirements?
Not at this point.
Okay.
Sorry, Michelle. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I was just gonna say if it's for restoring lake shores from species like invasive cattails.
Not at this point. There's no special sort of publicly available permit to do that. I mean, that might not be a bad way to go. It would probably be pretty hard to sort of manage, right, from the DNR perspective. But, DNR, if you wanted to do that, you would have to talk to them specially. You would have to, talk about your permit and then get some sort of special permit for that. We have a research permit as researchers, so we were allowed to do that because we were doing research. But general public, no, you have the 15-foot wide, and if you want anything different, you need to talk to aquatic plant management at DNR.
Thank you. So someone made the comment that they had chopped up cattail leaves and used it as mulch. It disintegrated in 2 years. Is there other uses for the biomass that's removed?
Yeah, good question. So there are people trying lots of different things. So there was a group in the Great Lakes region that was looking at pelletizing it and burning it, right, as biomass, as like a little pellet in a pellet stove. That does work. It's expensive to do that. People have looked at using it as biomass for a biodigester, right, to produce biogas. The real problem is it's a lot, and so you have to transport it. We were actually looking at trying to transport it to a biodigester, but the cost for trucking is prohibitively expensive, and actually maybe that's not super environmentally sustainable, so it's challenging. In terms of compost, I think that is a great idea. Voyageurs National Park has a cattail project, and you can actually go to they have a website on it, and they are doing cattail removals, and often what they do is remove the cattail, they cut it, the biomass, pile it on shore to smash down the cattail that's on shore, and then they reseed it with a native plant mix. And then they're basically using that dead cattail as compost or mulch to grow native plants on. So that is a good possibility. I would say that, depending on what lake you're on, there are sometimes rules about where you can put your biomass. And the reason for that is if you take out a whole bunch of cattail and pile it up on shore, those nutrients are going to leach right back into the lake, right? And that is, we know, not a good thing. So depending on where you are, it will dictate where you need to go to put your biomass. Sometimes it has to be out of the watershed so that those nutrients just don't leach back into the lake.
Great, thank you. Next question is, when lakes have a drawdown in the fall, are those exposed cattail roots damaged by freezing?
That is a good question. I would say probably not. Those are often locked in ice in the winter anyway, so I don't think that is going to damage those roots. What we see typically happen is there's a drawdown, and if that cattail is sort of still alive and still has the energy, it'll shoot up a stem, if there's still water. So I don't think that ice damages the roots in that way, but I'm not 100% sure.
Right. The next question is wondering if you foresee Minnesota legislature removing protection from invasive and hybridized cattail. Is there any discussion on this?
I don't know the discussion in the legislature. I know that the DNR would be happy to have data, right? I think rather than just a blanket rule, it would be better to be informed by data, right? And then the DNR could make the policy change if that's needed or not needed. So I don't know of any changes happening in the legislature at the moment. I do know that people are frustrated with cattail, that there hasn't been a lot of data. So what we're hoping to do is provide data that would allow the DNR to make an informed decision about it. So that's about what I know about that.
Great. Next question is, what control options are feasible and appropriate for landowners?
I think that right now, like in the world at this moment, it's aquatic plant management permit. That's the thing to do. So, and there's ways you can, well, and I would say too, be vigilant on your lakeshore, right? If you see it coming in, then you need to maybe look at a permit and try to handle it before it gets really extensive. There are plenty of lakes that still don't have it. There are some places in lakes where it exists, and we can try to stop the spread of it. But I think mechanical removal is the best option via the aquatic plant management permit. Herbicide is hard on water. It's not a great option. And you can do the mechanical removal there's lots of people that will contract to do it. It can be expensive. You can also buy what I call an underwater weed whacker, which is basically what it is that works underwater. That's what we do. You cut the stem underwater. That's, if you have a permit, that's acceptable. You can't remove any of the sediment, right? That's a totally different ball of wax when you're talking about permits. But I would say that mechanical removal works well, and getting rid of the dead biomass, even if you're not pulling it out, if you can get rid of the actual dead cattail, that can make a big difference in having plants grow back.
Thank you. Once you cut the cattails down below the water line, how long until you see growth again?
Good question. So based on this summer, if you cut it in the spring, it seems to grow back pretty readily. In the places, if you cut it in the fall and it stays submerged, it should not grow back. If that's the case, if you have like the best case scenario, right, your stems stay underwater, what will eventually happen, and what we've seen happen over time in some of our older cuts in other places, is, remember I showed the picture of the rhizome, so that those cattails that are standing along the edge will eventually shoot a rhizome, and you'll see stems come up along the edge. So you're never going to not have to deal with it, right? You're never going to not have maintenance. But what we envision is that, the maintenance would be low year after year once you do that first initial cut, but you will have to eventually go around the edge and get rid of all those stems that are moving in as those rhizomes continue to grow. So it's something that's has to be constantly, annually managed, I would say.
And then speaking of cutting and keeping them submerged,
Yeah.
how long do they have to be submerged for to eliminate the plants? And follow up of, will repeat cuttings help? And it sounds like.
Yeah. You're never going to kill the entire clone, right? You're just sort of like keeping that stem down, right? But anything that's growing nearby is gonna eventually encroach. So it's not really killing the whole plant. It's just suppressing that clone. And in some places, DNRs and park staff are doing some larger scale removals to try and really, beat those cattails back and get them not to spread. But it is a stubborn problem.
All right, we are wondering how much of Minnesota's lakes are uninvaded versus invaded.
I wish I knew the answer. That's a totally great question. One really cool thing that I didn't have time to talk about that I would love to study, which of course there's time and money, right? That requires. I had an intern this past year, I guess it was last fall, who looked at, can you use aerial photography or satellite imagery to see cattail on a lake. And so she did some work with drones and trying to train a GIS system, a lot of technical stuff to try and figure out, can you train a program to recognize cattail on lakes? And you can. So it is possible to get a sense of that. I don't have a sense overall. There's some data about the Great Lakes that say that, in those nearshore zones, it's something like 30 to 40% have been invaded by cattail. But I don't have a good sense. I will say there's a recent paper on the prairie pothole region and those wetlands, and there are invasive cattails in almost all of those wetlands from here into Canada. So it's a good amount of lakes, but it's not every lake. I've been on lakes without it. So I think being vigilant is important. And also the problem is sometimes you'll have regular cattail on a lake, and so people will panic and say, oh my gosh, is this the hybrid? And it's hard to tell. So you don't want to just kill every cattail you ever see if you're not sure if it's the hybrid. So I discourage people from getting rid of small patches of cattail willy-nilly without knowing what it is.
All right, we have viewers that are wondering, first statement being Wisconsin doesn't require a permit for cattail removal. Do you know why Minnesota does?
I think that, let's see, I don't know the reason for Wisconsin. I know Minnesota requires permits for any vegetation removal. So the reason for that, fundamentally, the biological reason, is that plants are super important, right? So in some places you remove vegetation and then you just get erosion, and that's not great. And as you recall, my big beginning about like needing all those different types of plants, anytime you're removing vegetation, you're probably, and if it's not a really dense invasive, you're probably negatively affecting your lake ecosystem. So the reason for the permit is so that DNR can come out and say, okay, yes, you can remove this amount for your boat, you can remove this amount for whatever. Okay, it's invasive cattail, you can remove it for that. So the reason for the permit is that removing vegetation isn't always a great idea.
Thank you. So the next question is, how can we get help IDing cattails on our shore? And can we pull cattails if they're confirmed invasive or hybrid? I think you touched on that a little bit, but
yeah, you can't pull them without a permit. Identification is hard. What I would say is you work with your aquatic plant management folks. You know, they have a good sense of what's what and how it grows. And so they would probably be able to tell you, okay, yeah, this is invasive cattail. Maybe we can, you know, you can have the permit to remove this. The only, you know, when I go to lakes and I see a huge stand that's taken over the entire lake shore, you know, that is mostly hybrid cattail. And if I go in the summer and I can see some of the differences that I know, then I can be relatively confident. I recently went to a lake in more northern Minnesota where someone said, hey, do I have hybrid cattail? And I don't think they did. I can't be 100% sure, right? But it was growing with lots of other plants and it had the characteristics of the native. But even then, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not hybrid cattail. When I see a big stand of hybrid cattail, I can tell. So I would say ask your DNR, work with your aquatic plant management folks. They know a lot what they're doing and they're happy to come out and look and see. For me, I would have to submit the genetics to a genetics lab really to be sure. It's very difficult. That was kind of a roundabout answer. Hopefully I answered that.
yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. Have you measured, we know you measured water quality and you looking at plants and animals, fish. Have you measured or made any observations about any extra sediment that was created or found in the dense cattail areas compared to a non-invaded area?
Not necessarily. So you mean when there's cattail there, like is there more sediment in those areas? Not necessarily, but it's also really hard to tell what happens with cattail over time. And I would say something else I didn't talk about is the age of the stand is really important. You know, as cattail stands age, they've grown and died and grown and died and grown and died, and all that biomass gets packed down. And so you can almost walk on what was once water, right? Aquatic environment. So it does create sort of a terrestrial environment. It does probably trap sediment more. I have never measured that. We do know that when we remove cattail, sometimes in these in our swaths, and then you have a big change in water level, sometimes you'll see that lifts all of the roots from the cattail and becomes sort of this floating bog of cattail, which is another big problem. So that's another issue um, with cattails and cattail removal. But I have not really noted more sediment in those areas.
Great, thank you. And I do have a little note from Megan saying that there are some comments coming in that Wisconsin does indeed require permits for removal.
Great. Yeah, I do not know the rules in Wisconsin. So so yeah, it would be good to look that up. Yeah, good to look that up.
Yeah, completely fair. All right. I'm excited about this question. So what are your thoughts on the ecological importance of hybrid cattail playing in lakes in southern Minnesota where other native aquatic plants aren't present any longer?
It's a
The likelihood of them establishing are minimal.
Really good question. So, and in fact, that gets to something we couldn't do. Like one of our goals when we really initially proposed this project was to get a range of lakes all the way to southern Minnesota. Because I think one of the issues is, great, in these northern lakes, you remove cattail, native plants grow back. That's awesome. We were unable to coordinate sites in southern Minnesota. So we wanted some more southern sites just to see if when you remove cattail, perhaps nothing grows back and then you have erosion problems. So that's why I'm super hesitant about saying, hey, yeah, just remove your cattail everywhere, because I think on a case by case basis, it can really make a difference. We would like to get down to those southern lakes. The DNR was really wanted us to work on public land rather than private land for this project. So we just couldn't coordinate a great spot to do that, but maybe we will in the future and then we can figure that out. So I think that's a really important point and a good question.
All right. So this next question is a little bit vague, but we have multiple people that want to hear about it.
Okay.
It's what about non-lake property owners with cattails growing in wet areas? So maybe if you can touch on management opportunities,
Yeah.
and whatever else you think.
Yeah, that's super complicated. And they can be a big issue. I mean, the prairie pothole region of those shallow wetlands in western Minnesota and all the way, through the Dakotas is really it's a sticky issue, partly because there's a lot of amphibians there and you don't necessarily want to willy-nilly put herbicide. One thing, and this is not what I have ever done, one thing I know that sometimes folks do, again, you would have to have whatever relevant permit. Like, I'm a lake person, right? So I can say nothing about what you need in terms of permits to remove plants. Wetlands are very protected, so I would not remove any plants from a wet area without the appropriate permit. But in some research studies in wetlands, what they've done is they've cut cattail as we have mechanically removed it, and then painted some of the stems with herbicide. So rather than just like spraying it all over everything, trying to target those removals to try and kill those stems. It doesn't work super well, but it has a little bit more effectiveness, at least in the research project, than just cutting it. But I would say, mechanical removal is your best bet, and trying to prevent the spread of it. But you'd have to figure out what that permitting looks like.
Great. So the next question is, will this slideshow be made available? I do want to note that, again, we are recording, and so we will post this entire webinar online. Did you want to provide it in the follow-up email? Otherwise, we can certainly just send people to our YouTube channel. Is just
Yeah, either way. Yeah, I mean, I can, if that works, I'm happy to provide it in a follow-up email. Sure. Yeah. And if you're going to be there's a May-Circ showcase next week. So Claire will be presenting on this as well. It'll be similar, but Claire will have her spin on it and maybe some better field photos from this summer.
right. All right. So does walking through a cattail stand to complete removal cause any damage to native plants, amphibians, etc.? Commenting on maybe removing during ice being a better alternative because of those.
Yeah, good question. I'm sure that when we walk through, we're impacting plants. Aquatic plants can be pretty resilient. I've seen a lot of photos where, people have a spot to move their boat in and out, and they've cut cattail, and actually the native plants grow back despite frequent use with your boat. But I'm sure we are pressing down on some native plants when we walk through a cattail stand. It's really, really hard to walk through a cattail stand. It's really, really dense. And I've had 3 technicians get lost for a whole day in a cattail stand because, of course, it's far taller than any people and you can't see where you're going. So they were fine. They found their way out, but they called me in the middle. They were like, "We can't find our way out." They made it, but it can be kind of an eerie place to walk through.
So I think we'll do maybe one more quick question. Are you aware of any research exploring how invasive cattail affect waterfowl breeding or migration?
Yes, there's been some recent research, and I can't tell you the name, but especially secretive marsh birds and some wading birds, really cattail is not great for them. It doesn't leave them a lot of places to feed. It's so dense that it's not really a hospitable environment for them. So yeah, there has been some recent research showing that cattail is bad for certain species of birds. Marsh wrens like it, if you're in like red-winged blackbirds use it, but for some of those rare species, it does displace them from these habitats, and it's not great for waterfowl feeding either because it's so dense.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we are really getting close to the 2 o'clock mark, so I have a few more comments to make. I just want to say that thank you for joining us, Amy. We really appreciate your presentation and information you provided today. One more reminder that this is a recorded webinar and that we are going to be putting it up on our YouTube channel, which you can find the link there on the screen. Watch your inboxes for notifications on when that goes live. And we do have a survey that we ask you to complete. It helps us make sure we're on the right track when we're planning topics. and guest speakers to come in for these. So we would appreciate if you could fill that out. It should pop up when you close out your screen, and you will likely get an email with that as well. We did not get through all of the questions. There were so many great ones. Thank you all for your participation in that. But if you do have a burning question that you would like to have answered, Amy's email is on the screen right now. Feel free to reach out to her, and I'm sure she'd be happy to help you out with an answer. And then if you do have any questions about our AIS Detectors program, our email is also listed. Next webinar is going to be in November, and we encourage you to register for that. We have links on our Facebook page, and we will also send out emails for that as well. The topic is going to be impacting the above average intentions of Minnesota anglers, wondering, does message medium matter? And we're going to be inviting Ingrid Schneider and our very own Megan Weber to tell us about that. So again, thank you so much for coming, Amy, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.